So, okay, it's now recording. Boa noite a todos, a todas. A gente faz, nesse exato instante, o começo da sessão de abertura do 13º encontro da Associação Keynesiana Brasileira. É um encontro novo, atípico, em meio a essa pandemia, mas, sem sombra de dúvidas, tem sido até aqui, porque a gente já vem desde segunda-feira com o workshop e a escola, fazendo o Encontro da AKB. Então, independente das circunstâncias, o encontro tem sido um sucesso. Este encontro só é um sucesso porque nós temos um grupo de pessoas que está envolvido em fazer esse encontro. E eu preciso agradecer de partida a todas estas pessoas e cito-as nominalmente aqui, tá? Em reconhecimento a tudo que essas pessoas têm feito pela AKB. São elas, tá? Da diretoria da AKB, Eliane Araújo, Júlia Braga, Marília Bassetti, Marcelo Milan, Rafael Ribeiro, tá? E junto comigo na presidência, Juliano Oliveira. Tá? Além disso, eu preciso agradecer outras 4 pessoas que, embora não sejam da diretoria da AKB, vestiram a camiseta da organização do encontro e conosco estão para poder fazer com que seja o sucesso que tem sido este 13º encontro, juntamente com o 2º workshop e com a 4ª escola da AKB. Essas 4 pessoas são a professora Fernanda Cardoso, que eu ia falar e apareceu aqui, então foi uma transmissão de pensamento, a professora Patrícia Cunha, que eu estou vendo ali o nome, o professor Guilherme Magacho, que agora está na França, trabalhando na Agência Francesa de Desenvolvimento, e a Lilian Rolim, que é doutoranda na Unicamp. Tá? O encontro da AKB presencial seria feito na Universidade Federal do ABC, na qual eu estou vinculado, tá? E por conta da pandemia, a gente não pôde fazer um encontro presencial. Então, para o ano que vem, a nossa expectativa é que possamos fazer esse encontro presencial lá em São Bernardo, né? Ou ali em São Bernardo. E, de todo modo, o grupo da organização lá da UFABC, composto por mim, pela Fernanda, pela Patrícia e pelo Guilherme, continuou, tá? Vestido a camiseta e, com isso, nos ajudou muito a preparar esse encontro e nós tivemos também a ajuda da Lília. Portanto, a gente tem um grupo que é maior do que a diretoria, a presidência da AKB. Espero que isso esteja reconhecido a todos e a todas. O meu muito obrigado. A AKB não conseguiria fazer esse encontro sem vocês. Tá? E para que esse encontro também se realize, nós temos 2 patrocinadores fundamentais. São eles, tá? O Institute for the New Economic Thinking, o INET, mas não especificamente o INET, mas o braço do INET chamado Young Scholars Initiative. Tá? Essa iniciativa ela já foi apresentada a todos aqueles que estão fazendo a escola da AKB. Essa iniciativa visa justamente fazer com que jovens pesquisadores no mundo inteiro se reúnam e tenham condições de trocar ideias sobre o que é a economia e quais serão as linhas relevantes da economia no futuro, mas sempre, tal qual o INET, né, com o New Economic Thinking. Tudo bem? Foi o ISI, o Young Scholars Initiative, que ofereceu para a AKB todas as contas do Zoom que a gente está usando. Tá? Então, nosso muito obrigado ao ISI por essa ajuda, que é absolutamente crucial para que este evento aconteça. Além do ISI, o outro apoiador que nós temos é o Conselho Regional de Economia do Rio de Janeiro. Eu quero, tá, a partir da Flávia Vinhais, que é a presidente do Corecon Rio, agradecer muito a toda a ajuda que o Corecon vem nos dando nos últimos anos e que neste ano, junto com o ISI, foram os 2 únicos patrocinadores que nós tivemos para conseguir fazer o encontro. E este encontro, ele é até agora aquele que tem o o maior conjunto de alunos inscritos na escola da AKB, e se somarmos o número de alunos com o número de inscritos na AKB, nós temos o maior contingente já participante da AKB até hoje. São 202 alunos inscritos na escola da AKB e 228 participantes inscritos no encontro da AKB que se inicia nesse instante. Nós, como eu já comentei, começamos o encontro na segunda-feira. Neste começo do encontro, nós tivemos o workshop, que é uma iniciativa da AKB com a SI. Esse workshop, ele é aberto para ex-alunos da escola, então percebam a corrente de produção keynesiana, e os ex-alunos da escola que se interessarem submetem um trabalho e apresentam, no workshop. É uma parceria da AKB com a SI, como eu comentei, tal qual é a escola. E também a escola começou na própria segunda-feira, ontem, e nós tivemos 2 aulas ontem, 3 aulas hoje e uma aula amanhã de manhã, que será a última. Nós tivemos as 2 primeiras aulas com a Fernanda Cardoso, deu a segunda aula, e a Laura Carvalho, a primeira aula de ontem, e hoje a primeira aula foi do Gabriel Porcili, a segunda aula do Manuel Castro Pires, e a terceira aula, agora há pouco, do professor Ramon, meu colega aqui da FABC. Amanhã nós teremos a última aula com Franklin Serrano. Nós tivemos, até agora, uma média de mais de 100 participantes na escola em todas as sessões. Tudo bem? O número só se reduziu um pouquinho agora na última aula, o que é compreensível, afinal de contas, a gente já estava entrando na 6ª hora de aula num dia, mas isso mostra o sucesso. Todas essas aulas estarão disponíveis na nossa TV AKB, tudo bem? No fundo, elas já estão disponíveis lá, 3 das aulas, A gente já teve 5, 3 delas já estão disponíveis lá. Eu só não fiz alarde sobre isso para poder fazer com que a presença síncrona dos alunos ainda aconteça. A TV AKB foi uma iniciativa que nós tivemos este ano para manter a agregação da nossa associação em meio a um período tão conturbado. A TV AKB produziu 2 programas, o primeiro Conversas Keynesianas, com 18 vídeos, o segundo Temas de Macroeconomia Moderna, que no fundo é produzido pelo grupo de pesquisa em financiarização e desenvolvimento, presidido pela ex-vice-presidente da AKB, Carmen Feijó, e presente da parte da Universidade Federal Fluminense, a nossa querida UF. Vários de nós aqui somos membros do FIND, como carinhosamente chamamos, e o tema de macroeconomia moderna é produzido inteiramente pelo FIND. Então, fica o convite, se alguns grupos de pesquisa quiserem ajudar a TV AKB, fiquem à vontade. O tema de macroeconomia moderna apresenta os capítulos do livro Macroeconomia Moderna, lições de Keynes para Economias em Desenvolvimento, que nós lançamos pela AKB em 2019, organizado pela ex-presidente da AKB, hoje diretora Eliane Araújo, e pela ex-vice-presidente da AKB, hoje membra Carmen Feijó. Tudo bem? Então, sigam-nos na TV AKB, faça a sua demanda efetiva e também afetiva, como diria Fernando Ferrari Filho, que adora fazer esse trocadilho, para com a AKB, seguindo-nos na TV AKB, tudo bem? Essa sessão chamada Cátedra Fernando Cardim de Carvalho nos foi sugerida pela Maria Cristina Marcuso no encontro de 2019, e nós, da diretoria, topamos a sugestão dela de forma a, por um lado, substituir as homenagens que nós fazíamos anualmente, e que nós percebemos que estava se tornando um pouco enfadonho a apresentação da homenagem, com muitas pessoas ao longo de vários anos comentando que acabava perdendo um pouco o gripe ali do encontro. Por outro lado, como uma forma de a gente homenagear aquele que é o nosso idealizador e o nosso patrono, Fernando José Cardim de Carvalho. Tudo bem? Então, esta é a primeira Cátedra Fernando Cardim de Carvalho, que será o nome dado à sessão de abertura da nossa AKB, ou do nosso encontro da AKB. E para este para esta noite, para essa sessão solene de abertura, nós temos o professor David Colander, que é da Middlebury University, e que dispensa maiores apresentações, pois creio que, de alguma forma, todo mundo já teve contato com o trabalho do professor Colander, tá? Só para dar uma síntese, né? O professor Colander tem mais de 35 livros publicados, mais de 100 artigos publicados, foi presidente da Eastern Economic Association, foi presidente da History of Economic Thought Society, e é um grande navegador de várias áreas da ciência econômica, incluindo áreas que são muito pouco pesquisadas no Brasil, como Economics Education. Eu vou passar a palavra agora para o professor Colander. Nós teremos alguma coisa em torno de 40 minutos, pelo que ele me disse, de apresentação, e depois a gente abre para interação, tragam suas perguntas, e muito obrigado pela presença de todos e todas vocês. So, Professor Dave, just presented you, okay? I promise I didn't say any bad words about you. So thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. It's a pleasure to have you here with us, and I hope all this pandemic goes away soon, and so we can have you here with us, physically sane, in the future, in the near future. Thank you very much. You can have your time, feel free, and now there you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, for listening to what I have to say, and for coming up with such a provocative title for your conference, the Keynesianisms. So when you think of it, sort of what exactly does it mean? And it sort of brings up the ambiguity. It's suggestive, it's provocative, and it leaves it wide open, so you can present almost all kinds of things, which is somewhat of a problem, because you try and figure, well, what do I want to say within the time to, sort of Brazilian economists about Keynesian economics. And I think, sort of, I thought a little bit of history might be useful, including my interactions with post-Keynesian economics, and also sort of the work I'm doing now on complexity economics. So I'll try and tie those two together and fit them. I think it's a wonderful title because it entitles such a Keynesian has changed so much. When I first came into economics, it meant something quite different than it did 10 years after. 10 years after that, it meant something quite different. And it was seen quite differently by other people. And so I think you have to really focus on the dynamic change that's occurred within the term itself. And so I think what I'm going to do is go to share a screen here, because I have PowerPoints, and see if it works. So if it does, let me know.
Okay.
So does that show the PowerPoint now?
Yeah, but yeah, it's showing. Okay.
So really, if you take a look at the term, Keynesian isn't enough. You have to have all kinds of other things before you can fit in something about Keynesianism. We've got to move something here. So, sort of there's neo-Keynesians, post-Keynesians with a hyphen, and post-Keynesians without a hyphen. There's new Keynesians, there's fundamentalist Keynesians, there's bastard Keynesians, there's Neanderthal Keynesians, there's coordination Keynesians, and I could have listed 40 or 50 type more. Pretty much, sort of, I think the bottom line is we're all Keynesians in some ways. And in other ways, we're all not Keynesians. And that holds for Keynes himself as well as others. Now, as a historian of thought, sort of I took part in those Keynesian sort of debates about what to call them. And I started getting into categorizing them And so I listed lots of different Keynesianisms in various writings that I did. And there were, you know, sort of the ones that I listed above weren't sufficient. You had to go to new neo-Keynesians and new neo-Keynesians to keep separating the different views. The point I want to raise is that Keynesians can include all kinds of different types of views. And so, you know, the usefulness of the term starts to fade away when it can include that much. So you have to think about it. How is it going to be most useful? And, you know, you have to differentiate Keynesians, I think, on theory, on policy, and on methodological approach. All three of those are there. And oftentimes people include one part of one thing, one part of another, in order to sort of get at what it is. So I'm Keynesian here, I'm not Keynesian there, I'm on policy, I'm in this, and sort of if you have it. Now, Keynesians were most useful for people just coming into the field. And, you know, sort of that's where the classifications sort of work the best. Because here, somebody just coming into a field sort of needs a crutch. Just as you need when you're riding a bike to first learn how to ride a bike, you need training wheels. The problem is you get used to those training wheels and then you start to define Keynesian or whatever term you're talking about as that limited structure and not recognizing that there was a much greater part of distinctions that went on that were missed by the previous ones. And so I think, you know, what I try and teach my students and encourage everyone is don't take classifiers such as Keynesian or classical too seriously. And especially avoid classification misuse. And by classification misuse, I mean sort of the sense that we smart, the other one's dumb. And so what you do is specify the view that you have in a way that includes all the nuanced understanding that one has to have when applying something. And for the other side, you give them sort of limited structured straw man interpretations. And then it looks that you are really, you know, sort of pretty good in where you are. And I think that's the problem that happened with the classical Keynesian straw man distinction. The point is, you know, sort of what I was taught when I learned economics in sort of the 60s and 70s was really, you know, that classical economists, you know, sort of were these sort of dumb-witted people who sort of saw here, you know, sort of they didn't understand sort of the debate that demand might feed back on supply. They believed in Say's law. They believed, you know, sort of in the strict dichotomy between the real and nominal sector. And then when you start reading them, you see they were much more complicated, and that what they did, what Keynes did, was sort of create a juxtaposed position so that his particular approach would look reasonable and the other approach wouldn't good. Unfortunately, as that happened, you know, sort of it lost much of classical economists' nuance. And by that, I mean, they didn't have a formal theory of the aggregate economy. And the reason they didn't have it is because it was too complex for them to believe they could really have a theory. What they had were a group of sort of informal arguments about the way economists, they thought the macroeconomy would work, and that showed here where lay people's arguments, simplistic arguments, didn't make sense. And so they didn't have a full theory at all, they just sort of talked about it. Marshall always meant to write a second volume of principles, which would deal with macroeconomics, but he never got around to it. So he stayed with microeconomics in partial equilibrium, arguing that sort of to talk about the general economy is far beyond where we are analytically and what we can do with it. Now, if you see it that way, I think the best way to understand Keynesianism is as a part of classical economics. So here, Keynesian economics, in terms of methodology, was very much part of classical economics, which saw policy as extraordinarily difficult and beyond sort of what people could say much about. That it focused on sort of general theory, because that's what it could talk about, deductive theory. It had almost no empirical work because they didn't have statistical tests that were useful. They didn't have data. So here, how are you going to do science is talk about it. And sort of what they did is talk about it in terms of this long run steady state. And here we'll arrive at the stationary state. And they sort of assumed, although they never dealt with it, that there was a single unique steady state that the economy would go to. And sort of that was a stationary state analysis. And sort of that's as much as they had to say, we're eventually going to go there. Now, what I think Keynes sort of came in the 1930s, it became very clear that maybe we were going to go there in 100, 200 years, but we certainly weren't going to go there within the time period within which we needed policy solutions. That's led to Keynes saying in the long run, we're all dead. So essentially what he said is we have to start looking at the dynamic adjustment process that's going on, and that can be very complex. So whereas you're sort of implicitly assuming that the economy is going to go to a long run stable equilibrium, the economy is actually a complex system of interacting parts that's always in the process of change. And sort of the adjustment, this equilibrium analysis, is nonlinear. It can jump around enormously. It involves all kinds of uncertainty. Once you take that into account and adjust classical economics for it, there's nothing inconsistent with Keynesian economics and what I call good classical economics. But that's not the way it played out because, you know, in that case, they wouldn't have been seen as something distinct from classical economics, but simply an extension of it. Here, let's start dealing with the dynamics which affects the equilibrium point that we go there. That's not the development that occurred. And sort of the Keynesian classical distinction referred to many other things. So when I first learned it, you know, it was very much about Keynesians were supportive of fiscal policy and classicals were supportive of monetary policy. And here that was a distinction that was important, their views on policy. That quickly sort of evolved as Keynesian said, think both fiscal policy and monetary policy are important. And so did classical economists. So you had sort of here were distinctions, and then they said, no, they're not capturing what's there. That led to a whole variety of debates about the shape of the LM curve. And so you started differentiating Keynesians and classicals on the shape of those curves. Keynesians believed that the LM curve would be perfectly elastic. Classical believed that the LM curve would be perfectly inelastic. So we had probably 5 to 10 years of debates about that. The end result of the debates were neither side believed either what the other side said. They always believed here, you know, the LM curve was upward sloping to varying degrees and at varying times. So it wasn't involved, the debate wasn't involved in the shape of the LM curve, even though all students had been sort of taught that that was really the Keynesian classical distinction. And so essentially, you know, sort of that whole, what I call the neo-debates led to the death of Keynesianism, where essentially, you know, sort of what got left out, by the time you put it in an equilibrium model, what you had was Keynesians believed in fixed wages, classical believed in flexible wages. With flexible wages, you'd always be at full employment. With fixed wages, you wouldn't. And that was the only distinction between the two. So that was sort of another of the distinctions that sort of evolved at this. And it was that time that sort of research at Keynesianism wasn't taken very seriously at all. And sort of Robert Lucas sort of summed it up. At research seminars, people don't take Keynesian theorizing seriously anymore. The audience start to whisper and giggle to one another when someone says they are Keynesians. And so, so we had a fundamental change there in that sort of Keynesians were seen as sort of no longer sort of capturing sort of the theoretical understanding of classical economics. And classical economics was seen as the correct view of what one should have. Now, it's about that time that I came in to sort of this debate. And sort of it was for that reason that I became involved with post-Keynesians, because they were the ones who would defend Keynesian economics. Within mainstream economics, there were almost no defenders of it, or the defenders were getting older and older and weren't seen as the in people on where to go. The post-Keynesians were willing to say there's a lot more in Keynes than what was there. So I was, sort of extremely happy to find and start working with them on it. So, and that was about 1977. And that year I was one of the 10 participants who attended a Columbia University meeting where the future of post-Keynesian, US type post-Keynesian economics was discussed and planned. Sidney Weintraub was there, Paul Davidson was there, Al Eichner was there, and they were the leaders of a meeting, and they decided to create the JPKE journal and set up an organizing conference at Rutgers. I was more an outside observer than an active participant, one, because I was just a young professor, and two, sort of because I wasn't sure exactly, so where I fit in the post-Keynesian structure. And I clearly am and have been a post-Keynesian fellow traveler ever since, but probably not a post-Keynesian. So why not a full-fledged member? I suspect the answer to that is partly personality and partly, sort of my underlying worldview about science and theory. I tend to emphasize sort of the differences or the similarities in views, not the irreconcilably differences in ideas and views. Whereas I think economists sort of who moved to post-Keynesians, most of the ones that I knew, wanted to emphasize the differences. So as I was looking here, let's say how close we are to a lot of mainstream economists, they wanted to say here how different we are from them. And that's sort of a personality trait, I think, rather than anything else. I saw, and try to understand most of the differences that we have in theory to involve framing an issue and the ancillary assumptions that we give to the gray areas that have to be used to interpret what we mean by that theory. I tend to emphasize that there are many different useful ways of looking at an issue, and to accept I may look at it one way, other people may look at the other, and the two, even though they seem different, are probably, have similarities if only we can get at what those differences are. And I find that much more productive than sort of focusing on the differences. The same reality can be described by different patterns depending on the frame and focal point that one uses. And different groups focus on different focal points. Now, within sort of psychology, there's a famous picture that they give, I assume probably all of you have seen it, of this beautiful woman or this old woman. There's two different sort of ways of perceiving that same picture. And depending on sort of what focal point you take, you come away with a quite different picture. Now, one isn't correct and one is incorrect. There's simply here, the focal point that you've had has taken that. That's the way I view differences in theory. That here, because you've looked at something, you have a focal point difference, and sort of they're seeing something else that I'm seeing, and somehow we need a discussion. We need a method of sort of how to get at those differences and see which one is useful when. Not which one is right or wrong, but which one is useful when. And that's very much part of the way, sort of I approach the differences and why I've never fit in to a lot of the heterodox schools. Because within heterodoxy, usually there's a tendency to sort of say, here, we want to sort of work on our focal point. Whereas I want to sort of work on understanding other people's focal point and perspective so that I can try and sort of see where do they differ and how they fit together. So for that reason, I call almost all theories, not theories at all, but heuristics. So here, a heuristic is simply an aid of judgment. It doesn't say this is the truth, this is correct. This is an aid of judgment of getting a perspective on something. And I find that sort of less antagonizes other people. To say here we differ in heuristics, then here we differ in terms of theory. So let me give an example. I'm a critic of DSGE macro, a strong critic of it. But I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I just don't see it as especially useful in my thinking and about the problems currently facing the macroeconomy. The same holds for modern monetary theory. I think it has important insights into money and could be usefully added to economists' understanding. But it does not make other monetary theories wrong, nor is it especially helpful for me in understanding current macroeconomic problems. The focal point dependent view of theory, which I hold, downplays the usefulness of formal theories and sees much more informal theories discussing it as being what we want to focus on. And that sort of leads, sort of why I haven't been involved as much in terms of post-Keynesian, even though I'm extraordinarily sympathetic to their ideas and find them, sort of useful in sort of thinking about it. I just don't want to limit myself to that and open up to other areas. Now, let me talk a little bit about Keynesian methodology as I view it today. As I said, I moved away from the Keynesian classification, mainly because I believe we're all Keynesians and we're all not Keynesians in various amounts, and that distinction doesn't help. And so here we start to need other distinctions to try and think about it. And the view I have is now one in which, sort of the real focus is on complexity economics. And here, do you see the economy and believe you should analyze the economy as a complex evolving system? Or do you believe it's best to analyze it as an equilibrium system? Now, the advantage of an equilibrium system is that you can get tractable models. The disadvantage is that the tractable models, you really have to stretch to connect them to reality. The complexity view, you essentially can't get tractable general models at all. What you can at best hope for is sort of partial dynamic models that captures a little bit of a picture there. So you can sort of see little parts of the reality, but you don't make any pretense of understanding the full reality. And that, I argue, sort of is really sort of key to the distinction that we should now be making. And that sort of for complexity economics, they agree with post-Keynesians that a key element of economics is the radical uncertainty that is faced by agents within the economy. The difference sort of complexity economics is it also sees that radical uncertainty as facing the people, the economists who are analyzing it. So you can't be as sure of your theory as possible. And what you have to do is be open and try and sort of bring in as many different theories as possible. And that's what led me to be what I call a broad tent Keynesian, as opposed to sort of a narrow tent, sort of one that can be classified here as post-Keynesian of this type or something like that. So I think the important Keynesian focal point is that there's a dynamic interplay in any adjustment process that the economy goes through that will be captured by complex dynamics, which means it's a highly mathematical sort of study the formal theory of it, and we can talk informally about theory, but really without sort of getting into sort of nonlinear dynamics, it's probably, sort of pushing the limits of where we are to think we can even have something useful to say about it. That's just about theory. We can have lots to say about policy and lots to say about sort of here's the way the economy works, but that's about heuristics, not about theory. Theory is that which we're willing to believe is correct or not, whereas heuristics we're quite willing to say they're useful. And I use it because I find it useful. And if you can show me some better heuristics, I'd be happy to switch. You don't say that with theory. Theory, once you believe something, it is really hard to see oneself switching there. And so that has led me to sort of emphasize that really the distinction is really one of sort of not dealing with Keynesian economics, but rather dealing with what I call Walrasian versus post-Walrasian economics. Post-Walrasian involves seeing the system as a complex system, and you'll have partially dynamic models. I'd say all post-Keynesians are post-Walrasians in that sense, but all post-Walrasians are not post-Keynesians, because post-Walrasians will approach it in a different way. Walrasians are tethered to general equilibrium analysis. They want to sort of analyze it. And I find the hardest thing is sort of tell people here, general equilibrium theory is really nice, but quite irrelevant. I wrote that to one of the top general equilibrium theorists at Harvard, and he didn't write back. So I find that probably isn't a way to reach out and be broad tent, but it's my view. Here, it just doesn't help a lot in the set of problems because the economy is too complex to deal with it. And it's complex in such deep ways. So in other words, it isn't just sort of a complex system. It's a complex nested systems that have all kinds of organizations and institutions built onto that, which interact and take place within that. And sort of to get at it, to get at modeling it, you have to have nested models within nested models within nested models, all of which have nonlinear dynamic aspects to it, and try and solve any of those equations, and you can't. So what do? You deal with it in a different way. It's very much like, evolutionary theory. We have, an evolutionary theory, but we don't have a formal evolutionary theory. We use it as a rough guide for thinking about problems. And then we go in and we delve into the data, try and get at what's really going on in this particular subcase. Not sort of having general theories that will relate to everything, but everything finds its niche. And here, that's the way I interpret and see sort of the post-Walrasian structure, is it sort of sees that everything's finding its niche. The difference is that all micro foundations within post-Keynesian economics or post-Walrasian economics are contextual. So you're not going to be able to start, here's sort of the individual decision and move up to the aggregate. The fallacy of composition is of central importance. And essentially, sort of here, it means there's no sense really trying to develop an aggregate analysis from the micro perspective. It just has too many sort of assumptions that have to deviate from reality. So, sort of that's where I am. Now, one place where it really plays out is with micro foundations. Sort of the standard within mainstream economics is you have to look at micro foundations. My position is micro foundations all need macro foundations, and we have to look at the simultaneous determination of both of them, and none of the structures have done that. So, so there, let me now move to what I call a post-Walrasian research agenda, because I understand a fair number of the participants here are students, so wondering what to work on. And sort of here, what things I see would be useful. I think, sort of really to look at what I call the partial dynamics of the system is centrally important. And we won't get at the full dynamics, but we will get at partial dynamics sort of useful for particular cases. And those can be developed. It's an institutionally oriented study that will sort of be specific for things, but you can find similar institutions and see if there's similarities there. It involves case studies, a quite different approach than is generally taken within economics. The second thing that I think I'd encourage people to do is to study institutions. In a complex evolving systems, institutions aren't frictions that slow the economy down and prevent it from achieving equilibrium. Instead, they're the integral parts of the system, of the economy, and they give it the stability. So the normal assumption is, oh, we have these institutions such as fixed wages that are causing problems. No, we have these institutions which are adding stability, because if we didn't have them, we'd have total chaos. So the result that you'd expect is chaos, except individuals don't like chaos, so they build institutions that protect them. You can't assume away those institutions because they're central to holding the stability together of the economy. And analysis that shows that and looks at that and how organizations have formed to solve problems, I think is really important part of the research agenda that people should be moving towards. Another one is to study norm creation. We normally assume people know what they want. In a complex system, they don't know what they want. Wants, norms, desires are all determined endogenously, which makes it much, much harder, but also makes much more possibility of having interesting changes in policy that can fundamentally change the way the system's working in ways that sort of the standard analysis can't. Basically, my point is that what I see as the post-Walrasian Keynesian macro research is that it'll involve many different types of research. Some can be highly mathematical, some institutional, some informal, some focused on policy, some focused on not. So it isn't, here is the theory. Here are the whole variety of research programs which make up sort of the post-Walrasian research agenda. Now, to give you a picture of how I see some of the things being done, let me talk a little bit about sort of how post-Walrasian economics I see is similar to atmospheric science. Now there, so you don't have a general theory of the climate. You don't have a general theory of weather. But all atmospheric scientists agree there are pressure gradients, and there's a tendency for pressures to equalize. And from that, you can start sort of analyzing partial dynamics of systems and say, oh, this will often happen here, this will often happen there. And then you sort of develop a model that captures your prediction. Other people, using the same sort of general theories, will develop alternative models with slightly different assumptions. And so if you have 40 different models, you'll get 40 different outcomes. Well, then the question is, can we put all those together and get sort of a better prediction than any of the individual parts of those? And one of the interesting elements of complexity economics is it argues yes. So Scott Page's work sort of argues that here, when you have people approaching it from different ways, the sum or the average or some combination of those weighted forecasts or weighted predictions will be better than the other. And so you'll develop what are called spaghetti models that sort of follow through the dynamics and sort of compare them. And then you'll sort of be looking at each one and comparing them. So that's the type of research people will be doing, is on these partial dynamics. All assuming here, yes, within general equilibrium, there's pressures if prices deviate from supply and demand prices. There might be pressures moving towards them, but there's all kinds of institutional structures that'll push other ways. So you're taking those into account and let people sort of see where they come out. And so that's the way I see it sort of taking place. And that will be a very, very computational intensive method. Currently, we've moved from computers that were doing 100 million calculations every second. And now I understand, I looked it up, they're doing 8 quadrillion calculations every second that's going into these models. So they sort of can get finer grained and finer grained sort of analysis of sort of the interrelationships. And so can find sort of patterns that we as individuals couldn't find at all. And sort of what you're seeing with artificial intelligence is that finding of patterns that were beyond that which humans even had the possibility of seeing, and sort of starting to base policy on that. I think there'll be a lot of work going on within that, and that will be, sort of where the movement is in policy analysis, or in sort of research analysis. Finally, I want to talk a bit about sort of Keynesian, what I see as Keynesian policy in the 2020, and I want to give a different perspective on that. And, sort of first, I think I've made it clear that I think policy and talking about sort of the actual movement of the economy is too complex to really be determined by sort of formal theories and science. Economists should follow educated common sense, which relies on and is informed by science, but doesn't follow directly from the science. Policy is far too complex and entwined with values to be determined just by science. Policy differences reflect differences in temperament, worldview, and experiences of the researchers or policymakers as much or more than they reflect differences in scientific theory. And I think Keynesian policy is determined by the temperament one has, much more than it is by here the theory. And sort of, I won't go into it, but sort of the one thing I've looked at is Keynes and deficits. We often associate Keynesian economics with support of running deficits, but that isn't to be found in the general theory. Fact is, Keynes supported deficits before he wrote the general theory. In the general theory, he doesn't mention deficits. And, sort of at times did not support deficits at all. So when Abba Lerner sort of argued his functional finance, that here we could run large deficits, Keynes said, no, you got it all wrong. We can't do that for a variety of reasons there. So therefore, I think, sort of it's more complicated than being able to say here is what Keynes's position would be. Nor does it especially matter, because I suspect Keynes would have changed his position 4 or 5 times, because he didn't see it following directly from theory. He saw it fitting into the context of the time. And there are times when deficits make a lot of sense. There are other times when they don't. So to be tying here and saying we definitely view one way or the other, I think misses an important element. I think the real change that would have happened is in terms of sort of the real goals of the economy. I think Keynes, sort of would say, we're talking too much about GDP now and not enough about flourishing, what the ultimate goal is. And this quote comes from his Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. When the accumulation of wealth is no longer of high social importance, there will be great changes in the code of morals. We shall be able to rid ourselves of many of the pseudo-moral principles which have hag-ridden us for 200 years, by which we have exalted some of the most distasteful of human qualities into the possession of the highest virtues. We shall be able to afford to dare to assess the money motive at its true value. Love of money as a possession, as distinguished from the love of money as a means to the enjoyment and realities of life, will be recognized for what it is, a somewhat disgusting morbidity, one of those semi-criminal, semi-pathological propensities, which one hands over with a shudder to the specialist in mental disease. All kinds of social custom and economic penalty practices affecting the distribution of wealth and of economic rewards and penalties, which we now maintain at all costs, however distasteful and unjust they may be in themselves, because they are tremendously useful in promoting the accumulation of capital, we shall then be free at last to discard. Now, you won't find economists today intermingling their sort of normative judgments into their policy. But I think if you take a look at Keynes, I suspect he would have still done that, mainly because he said here the goal that we're aiming for is not to produce as much as GDP as we possibly can. It's sort of to create a meaningful life for individuals. And the connection back 100 years ago, we could sort of assume, yes, it's okay to focus on material goods. But for rich countries, such as the US now, I think we've moved beyond that, and that the problems involve an interrelationship between moral and scientific issues, and we don't have good ways of analyzing that currently. So at that, sort of let me stop and open it up for questions that people have.
Thank you very much, Dave. Shall we get some questions now? I will speak in Portuguese just to try to make people make their questions. Então, quem quiser fazer as questões, elas são muito bem-vindas. Se porventura alguém tiver acanhado de fazer a pergunta em inglês, pode escrever a questão no site que eu traduzo. Ferrari, a palavra é sua. Obrigado pela pergunta.
Thanks, Fabio. Thanks, Professor Colander. It was a very interesting presentation. I have a specific question, not related with your topic, but I try to bring some part that you present with the current crisis that we are living right now. As you know, and as everybody knows, this economic crisis, this COVID crisis, is related to a lockdown, is a supply problem, not specifically affect demand problem. I will emphasize this one, is a supply problem. And despite the fact that it's a supply problem, all governments are introducing counter-cycle monetary policies and fiscal policy, and to mitigate the economic crisis. But the point is, according to you, in the slide 11, I think that it was your slide 11, you told us that Keynes didn't support, and I agree with you, didn't support fiscal deficits. Then the point is, it was possible to psychograph Keynes to understand, to propose some economic policy to mitigate this economic crisis, the COVID crisis, or to understand the economic system after the COVID-19. My point is, what do you think Keynes would propose for the economic system after the COVID-19? I don't know if you did get my point.
Yes,
it was clear.
Point. Let me try and answer. I think I agree with you that Keynes would have said this is a quite different situation than we were talking about in the 1930s or other times. It's a supply case, not a demand case. That the analysis of this supply case involves sort of how bad we see the virus and sort of all kinds of moral judgments about what we should be doing about those that are difficult and not for economists to make. Policymakers, if economists see themselves as policymakers, they have to make them. But they shouldn't be making them in their role as economists. And so, sort of, I think, it's very unclear what position he would have had other than I don't think he'd be saying, sort of open up the spending spigots and run. He was sort of very much anti-deficit in running, mainly because he felt here we need sort of stability in the overall system. And the reason we can run large deficits for a long time, so that technically is possible. But our economy is built upon faith, which is sort of something that here can easily disappear. And so it's on the perception we believe the economy is stable. As long as we believe it's stable, it will be stable. But if people start getting here and saying cryptocurrencies are now at $70 million, everyone put your money into cryptocurrencies, the economy will blow up. That here, what we're doing by running enormously large deficits is opening up the economy to potential instability of the systemic type, which is the worst possible type that you can have, because the systems would collapse. And he'd be worried about that. I don't know where he'd come out on that, but I think that would be part of his equation and part of his thinking. That doesn't seem to be part of the discussion today.
Okay, thank you, Dave.
Thanks so much.
Quem tiver mais questões, so we are gathering more questions now. I guess people are a little bit shy to make questions in English in an online fashion.
Zoom is always a problem.
Let me see, I'm seeing Alan. Alan, não quer fazer questão? Envolveu tanta coisa que você trabalha.
Let me ask them, how many of them consider themselves post-Keynesian?
Vou fazer em português, se você puder traduzir, eu entendo, mas como Stiglitz será classificado dentro da tipologia que David apresentou no início da apresentação dele?
So Alan asked, how do you classify Stiglitz in your taxonomy?
Good question. A neo-post-Walrasian Keynesian. Joe can sort of jump from one to another very quickly, depending on which model you're on. He just developed a model that's very much part of the complexity structure. So the model that's just his latest working paper is actually extraordinarily complexity structured. Joe sort of has such a broad range of interests, you know, that he really moves around from one model to another. And sort of early on, he was on micro foundations. He left that and sort of just, so I regard him as sort of multiple schools, as a lot of really good economists are.
Professor Colander, is Fernando again. I would say that there are two Stiglitz, the young Stiglitz and the Stiglitz after the Nobel Prize. The youngest Stiglitz is a mainstream economics, no doubt about this one. And I would say that after the Nobel Prize, Stiglitz he approached it to the post-Keynesian economy, something like that. I think so.
I think there was sort of somewhat of a change. I think it was far less of a change for those of us who knew Joe, you know, sort of than others, sort of his writing. He might have always been mainstream, but in many ways he was never mainstream, and had lots of different, you know, sort of views. But he was such good, as he flew from Oxford to Columbia, he'd sort of write a paper of 60 pages long, you know, sort of, and depending on what mood he was in on that particular day, you know, it'd sort of follow, you know, sort of the mainstream structure or something else. So he likes playing with little problems and sort of seeing them. Here I can create a model that will lead to sort of unusual results. And most of his early work was sort of, here I can take these models and come up with sort of non-expected results because I can sort of work the math. Later on, he switched and sort of started thinking more broadly about the capitalist economy and taking positions there. And that was after the Nobel Prize. So I'd agree with that.
Thank you, Dave. We have another question. Please, Gabriel.
Okay, thank you, Professor Colander. It was an excellent presentation, very interesting. There is one thing that comes to my mind, which is the following. You mentioned that you would like to see a very pluralistic and open approach to the different heuristics, and to see to what extent we can establish a dialogue between these different heuristics and perhaps learn from each other in this dialogue. But I define myself as a post-Keynesian. What I see, it is true that sometimes post-Keynesians try to emphasize their differences with more orthodox, mainstream work. But at the same time, what I see is that at least we try to engage in a discussion with our more orthodox colleagues. So I feel that at some point we try to bring a bridge and to communicate with them and raise some points to discussion. On the other hand, what I see from the side of our more orthodox mainstream economists is that there is no such an interest on the other side. On the contrary, there is a very somehow the idea that there is just only one game in town, and this is the neoclassical theory, and all the other schools of thought are not really relevant or interesting, or they do not have much to offer. So my question is this perception correct? In short, post-Keynesians try to build some bridges, but I feel that the other side somehow burned these bridges before we can cross them. Thank you.
I think, there's an enormous amount of truth in what you said. But I think, sort of again, I have slightly different views on that. First, they got the power. Post-Keynesians don't. So the ones in power can sort of look and say, why should I bother with you? And somebody on the outside is in a totally different position. So somebody out on the outside being open isn't the same as somebody on the inside being open. But I quite agree, there's a whole group of people on the inside who are very closed. There are also ones, sort of who are open. So in other words, I work with, Buzz Brock, sort of who is, sort of did lots of work there, but extraordinarily open to different ideas. And I could name probably 15 or 20. George Akerlof would be one. So I knew George when he was at Oxford there. And, sort of, there were lots of people who would be open to different things. But what it takes is sort of here, somebody on the outside has to know the inside analysis better than the people on the inside analysis for them to be taken seriously. So what it means is here as a post-Keynesian, I've really got to study this so that the person, I really challenge a person in ways that they haven't thought about before. And I don't think, that's a tendency. So let me just give one example, sort of where it is. I always saw Jim Tobin and Paul Davidson as natural allies. I didn't see a whole lot of distinction between the two. Jim, of course, was sort of the perfect mainstream economist, sort of fitting in there. But he turned out lots of people, sort of who were quite outside the mainstream and was quite open to it. Paul, sort of was very much on the outside there, but had enormous insights into the economy and felt, sort of here, I tried to bring them together. They wouldn't talk, or Paul wouldn't talk to Jim because Paul felt that he had inappropriately used some of his ideas sort of in there and hadn't attributed them properly as they went. So if you get hurt by that, you can imagine, yes, that hurts. I mean, here was a really good idea that he sort of used. Of course, I don't think that was the case on purpose in any case, but it sort of developed here that wouldn't want to work together in a way. Here, let's write something together. Let's put it together because that might have more of an influence. I think those on the outside, heterodox economists, have to work really, really hard sort of to get to those part of the mainstream, which I call the open mainstream, probably about 10%. Now, if we're talking about macro, sort of that's a different story. Macro theory went off the deep end with DSGE modeling, and Solow became a heterodox economist. Tobin became a heterodox. Everyone was a heterodox economist, except those who followed this extremely narrow and foolish structure. And sort of the only people who went into macro were those, so that is macro now. I'm quite willing to criticize that and consider myself totally heterodox in relation to that. But I see it as differently, and sort of I did sort of the post-Keynesians books with sort of a lot of mainstream economists contributing, mainly because I saw here we're talking about the same things. Complex dynamic systems, how will they operate? The mainstream wanted to do it all highly mathematically and sort of had to, because that's the way sort of the methodological structure was. But it wasn't out of here we're protecting ideas. It's just that's sort of the way we perceive things. That's the way we have sort of able to handle it. And, sort of that was where I felt here, heterodox economists, because you're heterodox, because you're on the outside, you've got to work harder than those on the inside. So, that's my overall view about it, is so I agree very much. I think there's only one correct theory. There's lots of different heuristics. And so I think where Paul and Jim differed were on some heuristics that could have been resolved, and that they had the same views of the economy, that there's uncertainty, that it really is important. Jim was willing to sort of put it into simpler models than Paul was. But here, that was just a temperamental change, not a real distinct change. So you try and find those who you share something with. And it's incumbent on those post-Keynesians and heterodox economists to be the ones who do 90% of the sharing, because the other ones got the power. And so that's just the way life is.
We have another question. Okay. Gabriel, are you happy with the reply?
Yes,
okay.
yes, thank you very much.
So we have another question. It is on the chat. I will read it to you, okay? So Marina asked, Marina, say hello just to Dave, see you, okay? So Marina asked, I've seen you written about the ideological bias of Chicago's economists, and as you stressed today, citing the economic possibilities for our grandchildren, Keynes undoubtedly has a moral aspect discussion underlying his theories. We could say economics was born as a moral science, right? Are those cases different? How does the ideological approach differ from an approximation between economic and a moral science? Where is the threshold?
Again, moral science has a long history, and it goes back before science was science in the way we think of it today. Sort of science has become much more empirical, much more structured there. And, sort of there, it's not used in the same way. So moral science, I wrote a paper on it, sort of is hard to sort of specify what you mean. There are moral aspects to all aspects of economics. Sort of that's there. Whether it should be science or not is really the question. Here, sort of it's a moral undertaking. It will use science there, but it will have to use much more than science. So essentially, as soon as you start dealing with morals, scientists haven't dealt with them much. So they're just not very good at dealing with them. Philosophers have dealt with them. They've developed ways of sort of coming to agreement when there are differences of ideological and moral views. They involve sort of moving from an outside perspective, using the impartial spectator tool, using various other sort of reflective tools, and discussing in an analytic way sort of the differences and really trying to get at it. The distinction I made about the perceptions there was very much part of that, sort of recognizing it's a focal point structure that's leading to the differences. And if we're going to capture those differences between the moral views, we've got to get people back and reflecting on sort of the different ways they're interpreting things, because otherwise they don't see differences. They see them as just right. And in philosophy, there is a right and wrong, but it is not determined by empirical methods. It's determined by discussions. John Stuart Mill in On Liberty has a wonderful discussion of sort of how one has to deal with that. And it is, you've got to understand the other's argument as well or better than they understand it to be able to have a relevant dialogue that's going on. So, so you're not holding that there's pluralists, lots of different ideas. There's one, but we arrive at that through sort of means that economists as scientists don't know anything about. So that's why I've argued we should be training economists, or some economists, more in the methods of philosophy and philosophical discourse to arrive at sort of conclusions there. We can sort of add empirical elements to it. What do people want? What are their beliefs? Sort of in run focal groups, sort of catching that and saying, here is what we should be using. Instead, the type welfare economics we use, let's assume we have a welfare function that can never be turned into reality, and then we sort of drop it. So my own feeling is that the most important steps that we can be taking in economic policy is moving towards sort of adding more philosophical aspects to the treatment, to the training, and sort of the way we think about policy problems.
So I will take the advantage of having you here with us, and I'm going to make a question. Well, you ended your presentation talking about Keynes, and as Marina as well asked, when Keynes was finishing, for example, the general theory, or when he wrote The Economic Possibilities of Our Grandchildren, he was asking for a kind of moral change. I think, for example, if we look into the chapter 24 of the general theory, it is a chapter that is talking about moral philosophy. So I think that if we are going to change economics, first we need to change human behavior somehow. I think that it might be an exaggeration, but I think that economics comes from human behavior, not the opposite. In light of that, how can economics and the economists play a role on changing the way we economically behave in our day by day? For example, Keynes was trying to make we change from the love of money or the love of money accumulation to enjoying life, love of life. And he was trying to develop a kind of explanation of how the economic system works to make we see that we could somehow equilibrate or balance the economic cycle in order to make the economic problem be not the biggest problem of the humankind anymore. So I guess that that we forgot that lesson somehow, not we, but some economists, and I don't know if the mainstream economics is taking care of this needed change in our behavior. So to sum up, do you think that economists and economic have a have a role to play in this changing our behavior, our economic behavior?
I think they have a central role to play in it, mainly because they're so important in terms of policy advisors. Sort of, we don't have psychological policies, we don't have other policies or sociological policy. We have the economic policy. If you're talking about it, then you should be talking about social policy as a whole. I think that will happen. but it means here a change. Economics becomes much broader, and I've argued should see itself combining with sociology, anthropology, political science, and other ones, and becoming sort of general social science, that will make it sort of move more philosophical. My own particular work and own particular interest has to do with sort of entrepreneurs. And one thing I've discovered is that, after someone's made $100 million, they don't really care too much about whether they have a lot more. Every entrepreneur I've talked to has said, oh, I'm not doing it for the money. But if you say here, what do you want to do? All right, well, the money is how I measure my success. So I'm not doing it for the money to make the money. I'm doing it to sort of be successful. So that what we have to do is figure out an alternative game that people can play. And I've sort of said here, choose some amount when enough is enough. Be it, I usually ask my class, and some say 5 million will be enough. Some say 10 million will be enough. Some say 10 billion will be enough. I said, choose any amount. After you have that amount, then sort of you step up to the next game. And the next game isn't sort of playing capitalism as we currently know it, but is playing a more moral game of capitalism. You have to sort of undertake activities that, being reflective, looking at it from an impartial spectator, would be good of society. So you change sort of sets of things there, and sort of will become, I'm a level 1 capitalist. Oh, you're only level 1? I'm a level 3 capitalist, and I'm doing a lot more good than you are doing. That if we create that game and sort of structure the system that way, we will build in the morality and change the norms of people, because they're not driven by the money or desire for that. They're driven by the desire for success. And we need to reflect on that. And that's what I meant by flourishing, sort of there. We've got to allow and create new ways for people who are highly successful to flourish, doing good. And oftentimes sort of you see here, you earn lots of money and then you give it away. The giving it away creates all these non-profits, which oftentimes are useless, and sort of make the people who are giving it away very mad because they're not efficient at achieving it, because everyone's worried about collecting their part of that rent. So the whole reason to have had capitalism was sort of push away the rents, but then when sort of the people who make it give it away, and creates a whole new rent-seeking game. That rent-seeking and sort of preventing rent-seeking has to be very much a part of the policy thinking as we're approaching it. So that's the stuff I'm working on, is for benefit institutions in the for sector, as opposed to sort of for-profit or not-for-profit. That here, there's list of things, here's the norms that current firms can follow. And they're pretty lenient on ways you can make money, and you make a lot of money on a lot of things that aren't helping people, for sure. But here, things like healthcare, things like education, they shouldn't be for-profit, they shouldn't be not-for-profit, they should be for benefit, which means that we have entrepreneurs there sort of pushing it to see really efficient present development of these particular sectors. And it fits in certain sectors. Other ones, capitalism works fine. But here, I think health and education are two sectors where it doesn't work well at all. And that's why we need level 2 capitalism to deal with it.
Great. Let me see if we have more questions. Mais perguntas, pessoal? Aproveitem. So I think we have no more questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks for listening, everyone. And I wish you all good luck, and maybe I'll see you in a year or two when COVID's all gone.
Thank you very much, Dave. It was a great lecture. It was great to hear from you so closely. It's online, okay, but...
Good. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.